Flight attendant refuses black passenger's first-class ticket. Pilot's response changes everything. What begins as a routine flight quickly spirals into a shocking encounter with prejudice. What happens when the truth emerges and a courageous pilot steps in to challenge injustice? Stick around to witness this unforgettable story, and don't forget to subscribe and let us know where you're watching from in the comments below. David Carter adjusted his tie and glanced at the time on his phone. He stood in line at the boarding gate, holding a neatly packed carry-on in one hand and his first-class ticket in the other. The flight to Los Angeles for his keynote speech at the annual law conference wasn't just a routine trip. It was a milestone in his career. The line shuffled forward as the boarding process began. When the gate agent scanned his ticket, the machine beeped, and a green light confirmed his seat assignment. He strode down the jet bridge with an air of quiet confidence. As he stepped onto the plane, his eyes scanned for his seat place, 2A, window, first class. The plush leather seats gleamed under the cabin lights, and the soft murmur of business-class passengers filled the air. Before David could settle in, a sharp voice called out from behind him. "Excuse me, sir, I believe you're in the wrong section." David turned, puzzled, and found himself face to face with a flight attendant. Her name tag read Claire Thompson. She was in her mid-40s with a no-nonsense expression that bordered on scorn. "No, I think I'm in the right place," David replied calmly, holding up his ticket. 2A, first class. Claire glanced at the ticket and then at David, her lips pressing into a thin line. "Let me see that," she demanded, snatching the ticket from his hand before he could respond. Her eyes scanned the details, and then she looked him up and down with an incredulous expression. "This can't be right," she muttered, almost to herself. "Are you sure this ticket belongs to you?" David felt the familiar sting of frustration simmering beneath his calm exterior. "Yes, it's my ticket. Is there a problem?" Claire hesitated, as if calculating her next move. Finally she spoke. "I need to check with the gate agent. Just stay right here." Passengers nearby began to notice the exchange. Murmurs rippled through the cabin, and a few heads turned to watch. David stood tall, his composure unwavering, even as he felt the weight of their stares. Minutes later, Claire returned, the gate agent trailing behind her. The agent, a young man named Ethan, seemed uneasy. He avoided making direct eye contact with David. "I've confirmed it," Ethan said, his voice tentative. "Mr. Carter's ticket is valid. He's assigned to 2A. Claire's frown deepened, her irritation evident. "Well, there must be some mistake. First class is usually reserved for frequent flyers or special upgrades." David took a slow, measured breath. "I purchased this ticket weeks ago. It's not an upgrade, and I'm not a frequent flyer. I'm just here to take my seat." Claire opened her mouth to argue, but Ethan cut in. "It's fine, Claire. He has a valid ticket. Let's just—" "But," Claire waved him off, her voice rising slightly, "I'm sorry, but I'll need to verify this further. Sir, please step aside for a moment." David's jaw tightened, but he kept his tone level. "With all due respect, you've verified my ticket. Unless there's a safety concern, I don't see why I need to leave my seat." By now, the whispers in the cabin had grown louder. A man in a crisp business suit sitting in 1C leaned toward the aisle. "Is there a problem here?" he asked, glancing between Claire and David. "No problem at all," Claire said curtly, her tone betraying her irritation. "Just a routine check." David looked directly at Claire. "You know as well as I do that this isn't routine. If there's a problem, say it plainly, otherwise I'd like to take my seat." Claire's cheeks flushed, but before she could respond, a new voice entered the conversation. "What seems to be the issue here?" Everyone turned to see Captain John Miller, the pilot, approaching from the cockpit. His tall frame and calm demeanor instantly commanded respect. His eyes flicked to David, then to Claire. "Captain," Claire began, her tone softening, "there's a discrepancy with this passenger's ticket. I'm just trying to confirm his seat assignment." Captain Miller raised an eyebrow. "Is the ticket valid?" Claire hesitated, then nodded reluctantly. "Yes, but—" "Then I fail to see the discrepancy," Miller said, his voice firm. He turned to David, his expression warm. "Sir, I apologize for the inconvenience. Please take your seat." David inclined his head. "Thank you, Captain." Before David could sit, Claire interjected again. "Captain, I just think it's unusual. I mean, most of our first-class passengers—" Captain Miller held up a hand, cutting her off. His tone remained calm but carried a weight of finality. "Miss Thompson, I suggest we focus on preparing for takeoff. We can't afford delay." Claire bit her lip, clearly struggling to hold back her frustration. Finally, she nodded. "Of course, Captain." Seconds after, as the captain walked away, David took his seat, his movements deliberate. He placed his carry-on under the seat and leaned back, exhaling slowly. The murmurs in the cabin began to die down, but the tension lingered. A few rows back, a young woman whispered to her companion, "Can you believe that? She totally singled him out." "It's disgusting," the other replied. "He handled it better than I would have." David tried to focus on the conference materials he had brought, but the encounter replayed in his mind. He wasn't naive. He knew why Claire had questioned him. He had faced similar treatment before, subtle but sharp reminders that in some people's eyes, his success didn't erase his skin color. As the plane prepared for takeoff, Claire walked by, her expression unreadable. She avoided meeting David's gaze. The captain's voice crackled over the intercom, announcing the flight's duration and weather conditions in Los Angeles. His tone was calm and reassuring, but David couldn't shake the unease that had settled in his chest. He glanced out the window, the runway lights blurring as the plane began to taxi. The flight had only just begun, but David knew this was a moment he wouldn't soon forget. The hum of the plane's engines filled the cabin as the flight reached cruising altitude. David adjusted the tray table in front of him, trying to distract himself with a folder of conference notes. His mind, however, kept drifting back to the interaction at boarding. He felt the eyes of fellow passengers on him, some sympathetic, others indifferent. Every so often, Claire would pass through the cabin, her expression tense, her movements stiff. She barely acknowledged him, though she made a point to linger longer than necessary when addressing other first-class passengers. David focused on staying calm. Years of practice in the courtroom had taught him the value of composure in tense situations. But beneath his calm exterior, frustration simmered. This wasn't just about him. It was about every assumption, every slight that people like Claire felt justified in making about people like him. As the drink service began, Claire approached his row, her cart neatly arranged with an assortment of beverages. She didn't make eye contact as she stopped next to his seat. "Would you like anything to drink, sir?" she asked, her voice clipped. David folded his hands in his lap, looking up at her calmly. "Just water, thank you." She poured the water with robotic precision, setting it on his tray table with a forced smile that didn't reach her eyes. David could sense the tension in her posture, the way she avoided lingering. "Thank you," he said firmly, his tone polite, but pointed. Claire nodded once, quickly moving on to the next passenger. David sipped his water, his thoughts churning. Moments like these weren't new to him, but they never became easier. Each one felt like a small wound, a reminder of how easily people could diminish him with a glance or a word. A soft voice interrupted his thoughts. David turned to see a woman sitting across the aisle. She was in her late 30s, dressed in a professional blazer, her dark hair tied back neatly. Her eyes were warm but filled with concern. "I just wanted to say, I saw what happened earlier," she said softly. "I'm really sorry you had to go through that. It wasn't right." David offered a small smile. "Thank you, I appreciate that." The woman hesitated before continuing. "I've seen this kind of thing before. My husband, he's black too, has dealt with it more times than I can count. I just wanted you to know you're not alone." Her words, though kind, stung in their truth. David nodded, unsure how to respond. "Thank you," he said again, his voice quieter this time. As the flight continued, the murmurs from earlier faded, but the weight of the encounter lingered. David noticed Claire speaking to another flight attendant near the galley. Their conversation seemed hushed but animated. Every so often, Claire would glance in his direction, her expression a mix of frustration and something else, defensiveness perhaps, or guilt. Finally, unable to ignore the simmering tension, Captain Miller emerged from the cockpit. He walked with purpose down the aisle, pausing to address Claire at the galley. Though their voices were too low to hear, their body language spoke volumes. Claire's arms were crossed, her posture stiff, while the captain's calm authority seemed to wear down her resolve. After a few moments, Captain Miller walked toward David's seat. He leaned down slightly, speaking in a low, steady tone. "Mr. Carter, I'd like to apologize again for the earlier incident," he said. "I want to assure you that our airline does not tolerate discriminatory behavior of any kind." David met the captain's gaze, appreciating the sincerity in his tone. "I appreciate that, Captain, but it's not just about an apology. It's about making sure this doesn't happen again. To me or anyone else." Captain Miller nodded. "You're absolutely right, and I intend to address this immediately." Before David could respond, the captain straightened and turned to face the first-class cabin. His voice, calm but commanding, carried through the space. "Ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to take a moment to address something that occurred during boarding," he began. The passengers, many of whom had been pretending not to notice the tension, now gave him their full attention. "Earlier today, one of our passengers, Mr. Carter, experienced a situation that does not reflect the values of this airline or this crew. I want to be clear. Everyone who boards our flights is entitled to respect, dignity, and fairness, regardless of who they are or where they come from." A ripple of murmurs spread through the cabin. Some passengers nodded in agreement, while others looked uncomfortable. "I take responsibility for ensuring that this flight is a safe and respectful space for everyone," Captain Miller continued. "And I can assure you that any behavior that falls short of those standards will be addressed promptly." He turned to David, his expression resolute. "Mr. Carter, on behalf of the airline and this crew, I sincerely apologize. If there's anything I can do to make your flight more comfortable, please don't hesitate to let me know." David inclined his head slightly. "Thank you, Captain." The captain gave a small nod before returning to the cockpit. As he walked away, the cabin remained unusually quiet. The murmurs had ceased, replaced by a palpable sense of reflection. Some passengers glanced at David, their expressions ranging from sympathy to discomfort. Others stared straight ahead, unwilling to engage with the moment. Claire, meanwhile, stood frozen near the galley. Her face was pale, her lips pressed tightly together. For a moment, she seemed to struggle with whether to speak or retreat. Ultimately, she chose the latter, disappearing into the service area. The rest of the flight proceeded without incident, but the atmosphere remained charged. David returned to his conference notes, though his focus wavered. He thought about the captain's speech, the quiet acts of solidarity from some passengers. As the plane began its descent into Los Angeles, Claire reappeared, her expression subdued. She stopped next to David's seat, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. "Mr. Carter," she said, her voice quiet but strained, "I want to apologize for earlier. I made a mistake, and I'm sorry for how I handled the situation." David looked at her for a long moment, weighing his response. Finally, he nodded. "Thank you for saying that." Claire hesitated, then moved on to prepare the cabin for landing. Though her apology didn't erase the sting of her actions, it was a step, a small, imperfect step, toward accountability. As the plane touched down and taxied to the gate, David felt a mixture of emotions. The flight had been far from the smooth journey he had anticipated, but it had also revealed the power of speaking up, of refusing to let moments of injustice go unchallenged. The seatbelt sign dinged off and passengers began to gather their belongings. David stood, retrieving his carry-on from the overhead compartment. As he stepped into the aisle, a man from the row behind him leaned forward. "You handled that with a lot of class," the man said, offering a handshake. "Not sure I could have done the same." David shook his hand, offering a small smile. "Sometimes you don't have a choice." As he stepped off the plane and into the bright lights of LAX, David knew that this flight was more than just a trip to a conference. It was a reminder of the work that still needed to be done. and the strength it took to keep pushing forward. The warm Los Angeles air greeted David as he stepped off the plane and into the terminal. He adjusted his tie, his expression calm yet introspective. The events of the flight still lingered in his mind, but he had no intention of letting them dampen his resolve. He had a keynote speech to deliver, and if anything, the incident had only strengthened the message he planned to share. As he made his way through the bustling terminal, David's phone buzzed in his pocket. It was a text from his colleague Jasmine, who was already at the hotel. "Jasmine, heard your flight just landed. Can't wait to hear your speech tonight. You're going to kill it." David smiled, grateful for her unwavering support. He quickly replied, "Thanks, see you soon." Outside the terminal, a black car waited to take him to the conference venue. As the driver helped load his luggage, David settled into the back seat, gazing out the window. The city's skyline shimmered in the distance, but his thoughts remained fixed on the flight. The captain's intervention had been significant, but Claire's behavior reflected a much deeper issue, one he'd encountered too many times before. The hotel's grand ballroom was already buzzing with energy when David arrived. Attendees mingled over coffee and light refreshments, their conversations filled with anticipation for the day's events. David checked in at the registration desk and was directed to the green room, where he could prepare for his speech. Inside, he found Jasmine waiting for him. She was dressed impeccably, as always, her sharp eyes scanning him for any sign of stress. "You look great," she said, handing him a bottle of water. "But you also look like something's on your mind." David hesitated before responding. "It's been an interesting morning." Jasmine tilted her head. "Interesting how?" David briefly recounted the events of the flight, the confrontation, the captain's speech, and the apology. Jasmine listened intently, her expression shifting from disbelief to anger. "Unbelievable," she said when he finished. "And this is exactly why your voice is so important. You have to talk about this, David. People need to hear it." David nodded. "I've been thinking the same thing." Jasmine grinned. "Good, because this crowd is ready for you. They need to hear the truth." The ballroom fell silent as David took the stage. The spotlight illuminated him as he stood behind the podium, his presence commanding yet approachable. He took a deep breath, letting the moment settle before he began. "Good afternoon," he said, his voice steady and clear. "It's an honor to stand before you today, not just as a lawyer, but as someone who has spent his life navigating the complexities of justice and injustice." The audience leaned in, their attention fully captured. "This morning, as I boarded my flight to come here, I experienced something that many of you might find shocking, though I know others in this room will find it all too familiar." He paused, scanning the room. "I was questioned, challenged, about my right to sit in the first-class section, not because I lacked the proper ticket, but because someone chose to assume that I didn't belong." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Some attendees exchanged uneasy glances, while others nodded in solidarity. David continued, "This wasn't the first time I've faced such assumptions, and it likely won't be the last. But what struck me most was the response. A pilot, someone who could have ignored the situation entirely, chose to speak up. He chose to challenge the bias that had played out in front of him, and in doing so, he reminded everyone on that plane, including me, of the power of allyship. He let his words sink in before moving on. Bias, whether implicit or overt, is a barrier we all must confront. It exists in boardrooms, classrooms, courtrooms, and yes, even on airplanes. And the burden of dismantling that bias shouldn't fall solely on those who experience it. The audience erupted into applause, a wave of affirmation that swept through the room. David held up a hand, signaling for quiet. I share this story not to dwell on the negative, but to highlight the positive. When we confront bias, when we speak up in the face of injustice, we create opportunities for change. And sometimes, those moments of courage come from unexpected places. He glanced at Jasmine in the front row, her expression filled with pride. "So, I challenge all of you today. Be the voice that speaks up. Be the ally who stands firm, and most importantly, be the force that drives us toward a more equitable future." David concluded his speech to a standing ovation. The applause thundered through the ballroom, and as he stepped away from the podium, he felt a profound sense of purpose. The morning's events, though frustrating, had served as a catalyst for something greater. A week later, as David settled back into his office, his assistant entered with an envelope. "This came for you," she said, placing it on his desk. David opened it to find a handwritten letter on airline stationery. It was from Captain John Miller. "Dear Mr. Carter, I wanted to thank you for your patience and dignity during our recent flight. The incident you endured should never have happened, and I deeply regret that it did. Your composure in the face of such behavior was a testament to your character, and I was honored to play a small role in addressing the situation. I also want to let you know that we've taken steps to ensure incidents like this are handled differently in the future. Our crew has been scheduled for additional training on diversity, equity, and inclusion. It's not a perfect solution, but it's a step in the right direction. I hope this letter finds you well, and I wish you continued success in your work. People like you make the world a better place. Sincerely, Captain John Miller." David leaned back in his chair, the letter resting in his hands. For all the challenges he had faced, moments like this reminded him why he fought so hard for justice. Change was slow, but it was happening. He carefully folded the letter and placed it in his desk drawer. Then, with renewed determination, he turned to his laptop and began drafting his next case brief, ready to take on the next battle. David's story didn't end with that flight or that conference. It continued in every courtroom, every boardroom, and every conversation where he chose to speak truth to power. And while the fight for justice was far from over, he knew one thing for certain: the journey was worth it.